So hello everyone and welcome. Welcome all. My name is N.R. Chenier. I am a white settler and PhD candidate in McGill University's Department of English and the chair of the English Graduate Student Association's Equity and Diversity Committee. Those of us in Tiohtià:ke or Montreal right now are on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka or Mohawk territory. If you are not in Tiohtià:ke and haven't done so already, please take a moment to learn whose land you are on. This event is the third in a four-part series entitled How to Do Anti-Racist and Decolonial Work in the Academy and Beyond. We hope this and the next talk in the series, which I'll tell you about later, will provide you with tools you need to address the structural violence of settler colonialism in your work and in your hearts, or will deepen your already ongoing practices. I want to thank the folks at the Indigenous Studies and Community Engagement Initiative at McGill for generously funding today's event. I also want to thank the Department of English for supporting the series and Pascal Théoret-Groux, our department's multimedia technician, for helping me promote and manage the events. Most of all, I wish to thank Dr. KimTallBear for being here with us today. Dr. TallBear is an associate professor in the Faculty of Native Studies at University of Alberta. She is originally from South Dakota and Minnesota and has been in Canada at U of A since 2015. She is a member of the Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate. Last fall, I had the pleasure of hearing Dr. TallBear's breathtaking talk, A Sharpening of the Already Present, Settler Apocalypse 2020. If you have not heard it yet, I encourage you to seek it out. Today, Dr. TallBear will speak on diversity versus decolonization in the academy. Her talk will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A. Please send me your questions privately using the chat feature. And I think you're actually able to send messages to me, myself or Pascal, so be sure to send them to me. And now to our very special guest, Dr. TallBear.
Well, it's great to be here. And I should have memorized the, first of all, sound levels are okay? Yeah, okay. I should have memorized the territorial acknowledgement here. I don't think I have, but I'm in Treaty 6 territory here in Edmonton. So it's the traditional gathering place of Cree, Métis, and Inuit people. And there's a whole lot of other peoples that come through here. Nakota Sioux, Saulteaux, Nakota are relatives of mine, actually, people that fled north during the Indian Wars down south. So I love being in Edmonton. I'm quite happy to be here. And it's great to be here with you all today. I was asked to give a talk about diversity versus decolonization in the academy, or I guess it's part of a broader series on how to do anti-racist and decolonial work. So I'm going to start the talk by going through some definitions, because I think that we're not always on the same page when we're using these terms. And I think it's really important to sort of lay the groundwork for kind of a robust interpretation of these terms before we use them. And then the other thing I did was I asked for some questions from the community in English at McGill to help build part of the talk around. And so that's kind of what this is. We're going to go over some terms. I'm going to give some examples drawn from my own work on diversity versus decolonization. And those of you that know my work, I've been writing on Indigenous sexualities and decolonization more recently in the last 5 years. And excuse me, I live on Jasper Avenue. It's kind of noisy around here. But my older work is on the politics of genomics and science and the role of science and technology in colonization. So I'll be drawing more examples from that. So I know this is more like a humanities community, but I'm a humanities person too, so it should make sense. Okay, so we're still on the first slide, I think. Pascal, you're running those for me, I think. So let's see. So the terms I'm going to talk about may be related, but they're not synonymous. And these include number one, indigenization. Number two, inclusion. We hear a lot of that in the university. 3, reconciliation, and 4, decolonization. And I think these terms get used interchangeably much more than they should. So I'm going to draw heavily on a 2018 article written by a couple of colleagues at the University of Alberta that I have found really to provide a very kind of concise framework for understanding the difference between these terms. And that's Adam Gaudry, who's a Métis scholar in the, now my notes just disappeared, hold on, in the Faculty of Native Studies. Thank you, Pascal, for the slides. So Adam Gaudry and Danielle Lorenz, who are both colleagues of mine at the University of Alberta, published this article in Alternative in 2018, and you'll see the citation here on another slide. So let's go to the next slide, actually, slide 2, which is, Indigenization and inclusion. So this is just drawn from that article in Alternative. And they quote Rauna Kokkonen, who's a Sami scholar, I think who used to be at U of T, and she's back, I think, in Finland now. But she notes that indigenization represents a move to expand the academy's still narrow conceptions of knowledge to include Indigenous perspectives in transformative ways. So transformative is key there, very vague. So where do we go from there? They move on to the first level of what they consider indigenization, which is inclusion. Remember, it's inclusion, reconciliation, and decolonization. So in inclusion, we know that one well, right? It aims to increase, for example, the number of Indigenous students, faculty, staff in the academy. It supports adaptation of Indigenous students to the academy. So thinking about how they can adapt to this kind of institution and structure, faculty as well, staff as well. Gaudry and Lorenz say that indigenization is conceived of primarily as a matter of inclusion and access. And by merely including more Indigenous peoples, it's believed that universities can indigenize without substantive structural change. Well, that would be too easy, wouldn't it? So indigenization, as explained by Rauna Kokkonen, is an umbrella term. Not all indigenization constitutes decolonization, and inclusion alone is not decolonization. So I wanted to give you some Indigenous genome research examples too, to think about what inclusion looks like, because that's the field that I've been working in for quite a while. So that might be rainbowing up your laboratory, right? And we can get into very complex ideas of what decolonization means. That's not only about Indigenous people, because decolonization, as I'll note on another slide, is about returning resources to the colonized. And so that can also include restoring relationships and core values and foundational theoretical or analytical frameworks or worldviews that disrupt all kinds of hierarchies, not just Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So it's a lot more than just including diverse bodies into, say, a laboratory or a classroom. It's actually about transformative change to accommodate those diverse bodies. So let's go to reconciliation at the next slide. So the first thing I'm going to give you is just a dictionary definition of reconciliation. This is the weakest definition out there. And I call it a settler colonial definition. The restoration of friendly relations. Well, what do you do when the relations were never friendly in the first place? You're not restoring anything, right? You have to build new friendly relations. That's kind of a misrepresentation of history if we were to use, say, reconciliation in a Canadian or other settler state context in that way. Or the action of making one view or belief compatible with another. I would say that this dictionary definition of reconciliation is unfortunately one that the Canadian public, who's not that knowledgeable about Indigenous issues, might interpret the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to be meaning, and that's not what they mean. It's not simply about can't we all get along and can't we just reconcile our actually really disparate belief systems. So let's go to slide 4, and we'll take up a more robust definition of reconciliation that Gaudry and Lorenz also give in their article. Let's see, they say that aims for common or middle ground, reconciliation aims for common or middle ground, creates a broader consensus regarding what counts as knowledge. How can knowledges be reconciled? This is the tough work of doing this kind of work inside the academy. What if they can't be reconciled? And that's something I think that we have to talk about how to address. They say what sets reconciliation, what they call reconciliation indigenization, apart from mere inclusion is an attempt to alter the university structure, including educating Canadian faculty, staff, and students to change how they think about and act toward Indigenous people. So as I often say in other talks I'm giving, reconciliation is not really on the shoulders of Indigenous people. We're not the colonizers. It's up to the colonizers to change. This is on them. So how are they? So part of that is educating themselves, right? Part of that is changing their behavior. And you can look at a lot of the truth and the TRC calls to action. You can look through that report, which is widely available online, to see the recommendations from the TRC Commission about actions that they recommend could be taken across sectors of Canadian society, be it media, education, healthcare, the law, etc. So more robust definition than that first one. Let's go to slide 5. Okay, so this is drawn from my genome work, and I totally forgot this had happened. This is from 2010. Oh, and Dr. Rod McInnes is actually at McGill. I don't know, some of you may know him. He's over in genetics, though. He was the president of the American Society of Human Genetics, which, despite its name, is a global disciplinary or a global scientific professional association. And when he gave his presidential plenary in 2010, this was like a big radical talk he gave. I mean, from my perspective as a social scientist who was working with genome scientists in the US, Dr. McInnes was doing a talk that was kind of coming out of these very intensive negotiations that happened from around 2004 to 2010 in Canada around the CIHR, so the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, who do a lot of the health funding in Canada. They had developed these guidelines for health research in Aboriginal communities, which was the language at the time. And what Dr. McInnes recommended in that plenary that he gave in front of 7,000 genomicists in Washington, D.C., it was like a mega church of science. I mean, it was these big Vegas lights and curtains coming down and thousands of people on the floor and these cameramen up on stands and these huge PowerPoint screens. It was fascinating. We don't have those kind of resources in the humanities and social sciences. But he got up there and he gave this talk, and he said that with respect to genetic research with Indigenous populations, we must now be invited into the metaphorical tent of Indigenous communities. The multicultural and international nature of the ASHG creates a major opportunity for it to make this happen. So he was talking about that aspect of reconciliation. We as geneticists need to get ourselves educated about what we have done wrong and how we can do better. And part of that is it involves respecting Indigenous worldviews, understanding Indigenous community jurisdiction, particularly over biological samples, over data, review of publications. He was advocating all kinds of profound changes in research and behavior by scientists, that more robust definition of reconciliation. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had not come along yet in 2010, but you can see the building up of these kinds of ideas in that sort of genome area. In 2010, when he's giving this speech, when those guidelines were first published by CIHR, he never mentioned the word reconciliation. But in retrospect, when I went back to his speech this week, I thought, oh, that's exactly what he was doing. And I wouldn't have been in a place in 2010 to see that. So when he's talking about coming into the tent of Indigenous communities, he's talking about recognizing power differences, awareness of perspectives and concerns, etc. Now, he began to lean toward decolonization in that plenary. I would say, as he's talking about Indigenous jurisdiction, data sovereignty, things like that, which are about restoring power and biological resources to Indigenous communities. And that's where we're getting into the difference between reconciliation and decolonization. So let's go to the next, we're going to skip over the next slide, slide 6, and get right to slide 7, which is the definition of decolonization. So let's see, I'm going to, first Gaudry and Lorenz say that decolonial indigenization envisions the wholesale overhaul of the academy to fundamentally reorient knowledge production based on balancing power relations between Indigenous peoples and Canadians. So then we can go to Tuck and Yang. Many of you in here in this Zoom room may be aware of their really important article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, published in 2012 in the journal here noted on the right. And they say that decolonization brings about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. Decolonization is about returning land and resources, and we can interpret life broadly. Think about that when the next time you're tempted to say the word decolonization, what does decolonization mean? Think about what's being restored, what's being repatriated. And there are many, many things that can fall under that umbrella of life. The land is the easy part to understand, not easy to do. Life is the harder part. So they say it's not a metaphor for other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. And there were questions I was given that are kind of getting at that, right? So decolonization is applied to Indigenous involvement in genomics, and science and technology broadly might involve inclusion, rainbowing up your laboratory. And it also involves, I think, building Indigenous controlled scientific labs and institutions. It's about returning resources. We can have a whole conversation in addition to that about what does a truly decolonized lab look like? Is it just setting up a lab that looks like any old lab with the same kinds of hierarchies present, the same kind of capitalistic and militaristic influences in some kind of scientific laboratories? These are big conversations to have, but it helps to begin having those conversations if we start from a sort of baseline of what we're actually talking about. Let's go to the next slide and get a little bit away from the genomics. So I just wanted to bring to your attention an intensive kind of investigative news story that was published in March of 2020, really focused on the US. I'd be really interested to see if something like this has been done in Canada. I don't think so. This was kind of a big story done by High Country News, which is non-Indigenous, but has a really good Indigenous news desk. And they did this extended story called Land Grab Universities, where they looked at nearly 11 million acres of Indigenous land from 250 tribes that was taken illegally in violation of treaties, that was granted to universities all over the United States, and not just the ones in the West in Indian territory, but Cornell was, I think, one of the biggest out east in New York, right? One of the biggest recipients of Western land. And so institutions like this, and I'm sure it's the same in Canada, continue to have endowments and wealth and institutional clout built on the appropriation of Indigenous land. So I just wanted you to be aware of that as we're thinking about decolonizing the academy. The academy is here because of stolen land, right? Because of stolen resources. And so when we look today, for example, at the academy holding bones, blood, DNA, data, this is not a new thing. The academy wouldn't be here without holding all of that land. So when we think about the restoration of Indigenous resources, we need to think very broadly, right, about what that means. But at its core, it's always something material. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to say to that before I move on to the questions. There's just a quote on that slide as well. And this is happening under Abraham Lincoln. So ironically, one of the presidents who was viewed as one of the more kind of progressive presidents, right? So that quote says, through generations of land grant graduates have exercised this right to rise. Very few have thought to ask who actually paid for their opportunity to rise. Think about that for yourself as being within the university and how it was done. Your opportunity to rise through the university came through the transfer or violent seizure of Indigenous lands. Meanwhile, to this day, Indigenous people remain largely absent from student populations, staff, faculty, and curriculum. And then over to the left, it says, in the US, we are less than 0.5% of the enrollment of Native people in 52 universities. I'd be interested to know what those numbers are in Canada. And when I do this talk again, I will find out. All right, let's go to the questions. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about a colonist. Let's see, I've got 15 more minutes, and I'm not going to get through all of the questions that I was sent, but they really are questions that are getting at the kinds of things that I'm talking about. So, okay, now you've talked about those definitions. What do we do on the ground? And they were kind of about that. So the first one is a colonization question, which again is about the appropriation of resources to build or sustain the colonial state and its institutions, right? So we live in a settler colonial state where the colonizers came, stayed, and intended to replace. It's a little different than in other nations where the colonizers maybe stayed in Europe or went back there after a time or were booted out, but still continued to extract resources from their colonies, say, for example, on the continent of Africa, throughout Africa. Okay, so let's go to the first question that I viewed as purely a colonization question. Thank you, Pascal. As settler colonial institutions, how do North American universities contribute to ongoing Indigenous elimination? Well, you saw that in the last slide, right? By continuing to hold all of that illegally gotten Indigenous land and resources and continuing to feed off of that. So, but I'll give you some other kinds of more smaller scale everyday things. Not recognizing Indigenous governance authorities in ways that furthers appropriation. So for example, The kinds of work that the Canadian Institutes for Health Research were attempting to do could be viewed as a form of decolonization. They were advocating the signing of research agreements with Indigenous communities. That's a good start, where you negotiate what is each party going to get out of that research. Tangibly, what do they get out of it? Universities not recognizing community jurisdiction on who our peoples are. And we're going to get to this in a question here that I really do want to get to. We're having this epidemic of false claims to indigeneity across Canada and the US. This is not new. I've heard of this problem since I was a child. We've got running jokes about it. I think it might be a newly imprinted on the consciousness of non-Indigenous people because of stories like the Michelle Latimer story in CBC and many other stories like that have been coming up in the last few years. But that's a tough one. It requires recognizing Indigenous jurisdiction at many levels for the university to really deal with that problem. But I'll come back to that because I have more to say about that on another slide. So let's see. Let's go to the next slide. There's so many ways you can answer that question. It's a really good question. So this is a question on inclusion. What kind of mentorship role, if any, are Indigenous scholars looking for from non-Indigenous academics in their department or university? Well, the same kind of mentoring that non-Indigenous students or scholars are looking for within the university as well. Because Indigenous scholars have very few to no Indigenous senior faculty to mentor them, right? So often we do have non-Indigenous scholars, unless you're lucky enough, you're lucky like I am to be in a faculty of Native Studies that's dominated and largely staffed by Indigenous people. I think for other Indigenous junior scholars, particularly those who are first university students, it's helpful to have people who understand that. And that's a problem that is not just does not just affect Indigenous people, right? Any of us who are first generation in the university have had to deal with some culture shock and a level of not understanding how to jump through those hoops and move through those systems. So that would involve practical advice on promotion and tenure, grants, navigating the administration. One of the main things I think, though, to think about if you're mentoring non-Indigenous or if you're mentoring Indigenous faculty and students is don't tokenize them, don't overwork them, don't ask them to advise on all things Indigenous. I know that's really tempting, but it really sets up this extra set of barriers in addition to the kind of cultural and resource barriers to dealing with the academy. We are very tokenized. We're always asked for the Indigenous perspective, and as a result, really overworked in those areas. Let's go to the next. Let's see. I'm just gonna look at this slide here. I don't think I was ready to move on. Can we go back to the next slide? I think I had a couple questions on there. This was a good one. So the question is there on the slide, scholars view academic freedom and tenure as necessary to allow scholars to pursue research or ask questions in a critical way. Do Indigenous scholars view academic freedom and tenure as protecting their autonomy in research, or is the view more ambivalent? Yes, of course, academic freedom and tenure supposedly protect us. I have a lot of notes here. In what is an implicitly or explicitly hostile anti-Indigenous environment, but tenure standards and criteria, especially in disciplines with no critical institutional engagement with Indigenous communities. So when I say that, I don't mean you can be a discipline that works on Indigenous topics, say history or literature, right? But if you have no meaningful engagement with the communities who are implicated chiefly in those histories or producing those literatures, you will probably have tenure standards skewed away from the cultural and relational standards and requirements and structural conditions of those peoples and territories. So for disciplines, it's not only important to treat topics with care and theoretical precision, it's really important if you're going to change the way that those disciplines treat Indigenous thinkers within them and Indigenous topics within them, that you actually have pragmatic and good relations with Indigenous communities. And that's easier said than done. This also requires disrupting that kind of masculinist notion of objectivity, right? And many of you in here know this is old news, right? That you can't assume that you stand nowhere, but you see everything at the same time. You can't assume a sort of distanced objectivity to a topic. And the sooner you dispense with that kind of old school objectivity, the sooner you'll be able to think about, okay, how are we building relationships with the communities that we're studying? in order to overturn some of those hierarchies in research. So I think for us too, as for many people who have been marginalized in the academy, tenure is only a basic baseline of protection. Academic freedom is something we feel is under assault every day, not only within the broader society that I think of as kind of trolling about Indigenous topics and histories and politics, but also if you're within departments and faculties that are not Indigenous centric places, right? Tenure is only the baseline. There was a second part to that question, which is, what if an Indigenous scholar wants to do work that's controversial in an Indigenous community versus controversial within the academy? This is a really good question. The university, I just want to make sure nobody's texting me from here. Nope, okay. The university is probably less protective of Indigenous communities than it is of itself, right? The university is more concerned about protecting its own hide. So my guess in academic freedom and tenure is that academic freedom and tenure protects faculty doing controversial work to Indigenous communities more than it protects faculty doing work that's considered controversial in the broader society or within the university, if that makes sense. So I could go and do something really kind of edgy and critical of an Indigenous community and be really controversial, and I might be safer in doing that within the Settler State Academy than I would be by doing something that threatens the broader ethos of the settler state. And I'll give you a quick example before I get to the Michelle Latimer question. When I was about 2008 or 9, I was at a meeting at the National Institutes for Health in the United States. And I was in the middle of finishing my book, Native American DNA, in which I look very critically at genome scientists who are taking DNA and blood from Indigenous populations around the world. And I started taking notes at that meeting. They were going around in the circle and I was taking notes because I'm not so good off the top of my head, or I wasn't then. And I was writing my notes down about what I was going to say, how I was going to situate myself and what I was doing there. But there were scientists at that table who were well aware that I'm very critical of the kinds of science that they were doing. And I had been writing some popular articles. I was told to put my laptop away and stop writing. I was called out in front of 110 scientists, and I actually ended up leaving that meeting. 2 days later, when I was back at Berkeley, I was an assistant professor at UC Berkeley at the time. I was called into the institutional review board that was overseeing my consent forms, and I had 2 consent forms in my ethnographic research. I had one for scientists and I had one for Indigenous community members, and they wanted me to scale up, make stricter the anonymity, the criteria for anonymity on the informed consent form for scientists. And I said, okay, fine. And I said, do you want me to also do that for the Indigenous interviewees? Oh, no, that's fine. The Berkeley IRB was concerned about scientists suing them. They had little concern for, I mean, we had a baseline of concern for anonymity for Indigenous community members, but it was pretty clear to me, I mean, maybe it was a coincidence, that 2 days after coming back from a very high level meeting at National Institutes of Health, I'm called in to make sure that I'm going to absolutely guarantee the anonymity of scientists, protecting them. So as a critical Indigenous scholar of a topic that Indigenous communities had a lot of interest in, but that threatened to make the university, its institutions and scientists look bad, it was a difficult position to be in as an untenured professor. So that's kind of an example of that question. I have so much more to say, but I really do want to stop in 5 minutes because I want to leave, or I guess I'll stop at 3:45. I want to leave time for questions. Oh, the other thing I'm going to say one more thing in relationship to that too. I particularly avoided making bad relations in Indigenous communities and doing that work too. I could have written a chapter or 2 on Indigenous, particularly Dakota and other tribal perspectives of the tribes that I come from, It's a word we use in the US, by the way. I could have written a chapter or two on that. Here's what Dakota people think of this. Here's what these Indigenous scientists or regulators or policy people think of the mapping of the human genome, because that's what we were dealing with back then when I was writing this book. But I decided that I didn't want to make bad relations. I didn't want to go home and disrupt visiting by handing over an informed consent form. And that's the moment when I decided to actually research scientists instead. So I made a calculated decision to create controversy maybe in that area by avoiding controversy at home. And then what I ended up doing to get around that is I also wanted to critically intervene in the way that Indigenous communities were dealing with the mapping of the human genome. When I started going to meetings between scientists and federal agencies who were funding that work and tribal community people, I heard a lot of genetically essentialist stuff being said on the part of Indigenous community members. And I knew that I wanted to weigh in on that. I wanted to do work that helped disrupt that genetic essentialism, that biological essentialism. But I decided to do that work in a way that wasn't directly coming at them as a critical insider, but rather I went at the scientists in a critical way. And then I wrote my final chapter about recommendations for governance, regulation of genome science, taking control of data, what we call data sovereignty now. So instead of saying tribal community members, you're saying a bunch of genetically essentialist stuff, and here's why it's wrong with all my highfalutin theory. Let me focus on the scientists and let me come tell you more gently at the end some of the insights that I've gained in speaking with you and speaking with scientists and speaking with Indigenous scientists and speaking with some of the other Indigenous people that were working in this area. So rather than critiquing, I was able to offer kind of a productive alternative, which implies, I think, a critique of what we don't want to do. So I've kind of had to manage those kinds of politics in all of this as well. So I'm going to go for the last few minutes to So I got so many great questions. Let's go ahead to slide 13, the decolonization questions. Oh, yeah, I can't get to that because I want to get to the Michelle Latimer one. I wish I had like 3 hours, not that you do. I'm looking for the Latimer question here because this is really in the news this week. Let me do a search here. Slide 15. Thank you. And it says slide 15 continued. Not that one, maybe one more. Yep, that's it. Thank you. Following the recent revelation that the Canadian film industry's Michelle Latimer is not Indigenous, but had been claiming Indigenous ancestry to further her career, I'm wondering what a decolonized approach might be to ensure that people who are claiming to be Indigenous are actually Indigenous. If anybody's on Twitter, native Twitter, you might know that there's a list of pretendians or false claimants to Indigenous ancestry going around. Very controversial. There's a couple of podcasts out about it now, and I think I'm going to be on Native America Calling tomorrow around 1 Mountain time, I think, or noon Mountain, I can't remember, but Native America Calling is a national kind of online radio talk show, I think run out of Albuquerque. So if you're interested, we're going to be talking about that list. But that's kind of related to this issue. We have, is particularly on the prairies, I know Indigenous administrators, department chairs are thinking hard about how to deal with this problem. And it is a pervasive problem in Canada and the US. These false or very distant, kind of unsubstantiated claims to Indigenous ancestry. I'll just say right up front, because I study genetic ancestry, I'm of the mind that genetic ancestry alone, whether it's there or not, does not constitute a claim to community belonging. And I think if we could get to that point, we don't have to go around looking at everybody's family tree, looking at everybody's genealogy. I don't think we should have to do all that kind of investigating into people's backgrounds. If we can come to accept that ancestry alone, particularly distant ancestry where there's no capacity of connecting with community, no capacity of making relations, it's interesting, but it does not make a legitimate claim. So what are we thinking about it? Particularly, I think on the prairies, we're thinking hard about this. The other thing I want to see is we don't live outside of colonization. So looking for a decolonized approach to do this, Nothing's going to look perfectly decolonized. We are so deeply entangled in the colonial power of the settler state, right? You don't just walk away from Indian status. You don't just walk away from federal recognition. You don't walk away from the power, the cultural and the financial power of the settler state. And it is really hard to maneuver in relationship to that huge power imbalance. So that's the first thing. I did say self-identity. We're also focusing on self-identity is not sufficient. And I want to give you a quote too from another paper I've just written. I'm really critical of this term identity. I am using it as little as possible. And it's another term I think we should be clear when we're using it, what it means. So I'm going to just read this passage for you. That's a critique of identity. Identity as a concept in popular usage does not necessarily imply ongoing relating. It might imply discrete biological conjoinings within one's genetic ancestry, and that can possibly spur alliances, right? I'm particularly thinking there about, think about the Scooped, think about people who were taken as children in that genocidal act by the Canadian state from their Indigenous families and forcibly out-adopted with non-Indigenous families or put into residential school. There you have a capacity of connection, right? There's a community you can possibly connect with. That's pretty different than finding an ancestor in 1650. Pretty different, one Indigenous ancestor. Okay, so that's what I mean by when I say genetic ancestry might be able to spur alliances if that potential is there. But genetic ancestry can also exist as a largely individualistic idea, as something to consider to be held once and for all, unchanging within one's own body, whether through biological or social imprinting as one's body's property. Similarly, oh, I'm going to skip over this next part because I'm talking about non-monogamy. There's something else I write about. I want us to remember that we are always becoming in relation not only to genetic and cultural ancestors, and those are not always synonymous, right? Some of us have cultural ancestors that were not genetic ancestors. We are always becoming in relation to one another continuously and in relation to the geographies and political economies we inhabit, whether by choice or by circumstances we may have had little choice in. If we remember that we are what we become as much or more than we are who our properties determine us to be, I suspect that will help us focus on how to relate more carefully with one another as beings in the world. Okay, so that's kind of me. That's my critique of identity. It's individualistic. It's held in the body. My genetics, my identity, my ancestors, my lineage versus who are the relations that made me who I am. And the other thing I should say about relations and community, it's not always tiptoeing through the tulips, right? I'm not saying that that because relations are substantive relations, they're the relations that make you who they are, that they're necessarily always good relations. There's a lot to talk about here. But what I do want to caution against is this kind of propertied, individualistic claiming of genetic ancestry alone without the capacity or potential of also making relatives, being in relation, being claimed. So self-identity is not sufficient. Genetic ancestry alone is not sufficient. We in the university are advocating, I think, going beyond that to naming and documenting relations with a collective. You don't have to have Indian status necessarily. You might not have to have band membership necessarily, but can you document those, name and document those relations with a collective? Also that collective, that Indigenous collective should be recognized by many other Indigenous peoples as Indigenous. There's a lot to talk about. One of the things an Indigenous administrator told me recently, and he said it's going to be very hard to implement a lot of this stuff because Canadian, the hierarchy in Canadian universities, and we can assume that's mostly white, are really accustomed to dealing with Indigenous people or naming us, identifying us as if we're already dead and in the past. So this idea of active ongoing becoming is very difficult, I think, for people to deal with. They want the Indian of the past, what that looks like, what it feels like, what it sounds like. I'm going to stop now because it's 3:45, even though I have many more things I would like to say. But I will leave you with one of the most controversial topics in the last couple of months related to what I'm doing. Thanks, Natasha.
Thank you so much. I just want to confirm that I'm now audible. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So some questions have come in. As a non-Indigenous academic, I sometimes wonder if mentorship in our current promotions processes could be interpreted as a colonial process in itself. And then in brackets, it says assimilation into an oppressive system.
Yeah. Oh, the tenure stuff, was at the beginning of the question?
It was about the mentorship. Yeah, it was
the
kind of jumping off from that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, there's the cultural indoctrination that goes on, right? It's kind of like a chicken and egg thing. I think we need to get more, I don't like the word diverse, but you know what I mean, like more oppositional bodies, diverse bodies. But in order to get them there, and keep them here, we need those people there in the first place, right? When you can make a space that's more inclusive and comfortable, you'll keep. I think see this a lot with scientists too. So how do we get more Indigenous scientists if we don't have scientists there already that can accommodate their worldviews and accommodate the different ethical paradigms within which they have to work? And there is a lot of indoctrination into what's considered civil, right? What's considered civil normative ways of speaking and comporting oneself. I'm trying to think, I did have something else I wanted to say about that. Oh, you know, having watched a couple of friends not get tenure, who I do think really do incredible work, I think we need to, this is something that I think people with power in the academy can do. I think we need to adjust what counts as impact factor. Is it more impact factor to be published, have 5 articles published before you go up for tenure in the top 5, you know, journals, blind reviewed articles in the top 5 journals? Or what if you're on MSNBC, NPR, and CBC every other day? Who has more impact? I have a friend who was on news shows like that constantly, you know, in high profile policy advisory positions, but wasn't publishing blind reviewed art. I don't know. I think that person should have gotten tenure. I think it's really, really disgusting that they didn't actually, because their impact was so extensive, right? And they had enough. I mean, obviously they were being called up into these top advisory positions by people who felt that their work and their voice was making a difference. I fail to see how that's not high impact factor. So, you know, but then we've got to get people that have a more open mind about these things into these positions of power. So total chicken and egg.
Thank you. I'm getting a lot of yes, thank you in the chat to what you just said about the impact factor. Okay, how do you understand the relationship between concerns about labor in higher ed and concerns about settler colonialism in higher ed? How can the higher ed labor movement best serve Indigenous scholars, students, and communities?
I have not thought about that. I'm sure this person has an answer maybe. I don't work on labor issues. I vote and go the way that my allies, all my professor allies who are really critical, what they tell me to do, I do. So I admit, like, so.
Okay, we'll move on to the next. In relation to the question of indigeneity, can community-focused identity assist in the rejection of blood quantum politics?
Yes, I think, but that's what I mean by we don't work outside of colonization. Resources, the settler state ties its resources to blood quantum, whether we reject it or not. So if you look at the census, the way they're counting people, when people are identifying who don't meet those blood quantum criteria, we're expanding the population. It's getting richer and whiter for the most part. So as long as the settler state controls the purse strings, you can maneuver, but it's very tough. And so I think the best thing we can do is keep advocating for criteria that are not blood quantum criteria, which we do. But we also have to understand why Indigenous communities go in for that often too, because they are also having to manage resources in relationship to numbers in flux. But I think the degree to which we can call attention to why, like before World War II in the US, we adopted spouses and legally adopted children were all tribal citizens, almost de facto in many of the tribes. That changes with militarization, relocation, World War II, as people are leaving the reserves or reservations and going into urban areas. It's not that tribes suddenly became more biologically essentialist and brainwashed and colonized. They got structurally colonized because masses of people are being removed to urban areas and overseas now. But it's really following the political economy of the settler state that happens. And if we can recall recall that it wasn't always that way and why it's that way, I think then we can better figure out how to implement different kinds of criteria today. But
thank you. How do we as Black and Indigenous faculty balance wanting to be involved in decisions about our communities, example, hiring, etc., but also not being incessantly called upon and overburdened by service?
oh, I know. uh, I don't know. It's a good question. I'm thinking, for me, where I found a happy medium, and I know not everybody can do this, I made a decision to come into a faculty of Native Studies and get out of disciplines where I'm a token. And what it means is that I end up being one of those people who prefers productive segregation. In fact, because I'm in a faculty of Native Studies and 85, maybe 90% of us in the faculty are Indigenous, I'm not disproportionately being called on as an Indigenous person. Where I get called to do that is in the other faculties when they need a token Native person on a committee, right? And I resist that as much as I can, because I feel that within the Faculty of Native Studies, there's a lot that I can work on. And it's a really productive space without getting overburdened like that. But I know not everybody has that option. I do encourage particularly grad students though, too. I understand why you want to go to anthropology or literature or wherever you're going, but understand the position you're putting yourself in. You may want to consider more seriously being in an Indigenous centric department or faculty already, where you're not going to have those kinds of pressures, where you have support and mentoring from Indigenous people. So that's a much broader conversation, but I don't think enough people consider that. We don't need to go off integrating other people's fields all the time. Maybe we can build our own.
I love that. Thank you. What advice do you have for pre-tenure BIPOC professors who feel scared to advocate for BIPOC students while working with their faculty cohorts to recognize the unique needs for BIPOC students?
Being afraid to advocate because?
Being a pre-tenure BIPOC faculty member.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to answer that other than I just figured I'd move if I didn't get tenure, which I moved anyway. So it's really hard. Again, I mean, I know not everybody has a lot of choices, right? Sometimes you're stuck in a department or faculty that's just pretty hostile and it's the choice that you had. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that question. I do feel like we are called upon to take risks that other people might not. It's already risky enough, right, being pre-tenure. But I think doing that kind of work does make you more risky. I don't know. I'm a risk taker, so like probably to my own detriment. So I'm probably not the right person to ask. I'm reckless. Yeah.
Okay, here's a more open-ended one. You briefly mentioned taking decolonial approaches to organizing, and the best way to organize in community or in academia without using the same formal colonial militaristic hierarchies and structures. Would you be able to speak on this more?
I don't remember what I said. So how to move through the academy without relying on those kinds of hierarchies?
Yes, or I guess perpetuating them.
I don't remember what I said. I'm trying to think. I mean, just in terms of, this is stuff that I think is probably common sense to a lot of Indigenous and Black faculty and, anybody else who's kind of in a position where they've been pretty marginalized within this world. And maybe my students would say I don't do it enough. I really do try to do whatever I can to dismantle those hierarchies. But then sometimes, like for example, I have research assistants that work with me and junior faculty that work with me. And I am pretty comfortable, very comfortable and willing to put them front and center. And we do this in our summer genome program actually too. So one of the things we do is we've got senior scientists working with senior social scientists and then junior Indigenous scientists. And we're really careful about mentoring people on sort of grant getting and publishing protocols and putting their names front and center. We're very strategic, actually, even when we write collaboratively. And I would still do this. And I assume all of us are doing this, right? When you write collaboratively, put that, strategize about that publication in the way that they get the most out of it, right? The junior people should get the most out of it. They need it the most, right? They're the ones that should get the most kudos. Recommending them for, to the degree that they can, turning over opportunities, especially for those of us that are older and have more than we can take advantage of. But I'm not telling you anything you don't know already. So I wish I could sit around and have coffee and chat more extensively.
I would love nothing more. Okay, I think we're nearing 6 o'clock here in Montreal, so I will pass along one last question. How can students push their faculties and professors to even begin to understand the importance of decolonizing curricula and programs, let alone start making transformational changes? It's a big one.
Yeah. These are quite, I'm not somebody who has spent a lot of time, I have to say. I mean, this is why I ended up in Native Studies. I wanted to be working with people where there was a critical mass of us doing this work and making it normal. I don't know how to be, and I was a student. I was the only one in almost every program I was in, and that's why I really promote going to a faculty or a discipline or a department if you can. If you have that choice where you're not tokenized and where you're not the only one, because again, you're asking me how to do work as the individual with all of that stuff on your shoulders when I'm saying that you shouldn't be the one having to do that, right? I don't advocate that students try to change the system. I don't. I mean, I think inevitably we can't help ourselves, right? From wanting to make those changes and the kind of organizing we do and the student activism that we do and that kind of thing. But I think having a realistic view about what's possible as a student, but also gravitating towards those places where you're not the minority, where you're not the only one, because it does help to be in a critical mass. But I know that's not really an answer to that question. So I do advocate getting oneself out of that token position whenever possible and moving into another area where you're not in that position. It's pretty thankless to be in that position. I'm sorry, these are terrible answers.
No, not at all. I guess the last thing I want to ask is just if you have any other things that you want to share before we wrap up.
I really want people, as they're thinking about decolonization and reconciliation and what that looks like, really fundamentally, we're talking about giving up power. I mean, these are things many people have said, and a restitution of what was stolen, right? And so this is, and we think about this with all colonized peoples, what was stolen and how do you work on returning that? And that might mean promoting the building of, it's not only about returning land, reparations for the descendants of the enslaved, but it's also about supporting the building of their institutions that might not include you necessarily too. I am somebody who grew up in Indigenous community, both urban and reservation. And I know the value. There's deprivation in segregation, but there's also value in being the majority in a place, right? There's a kind of cultural intensity and cultural production and a sense of self-confidence that comes from being not a minority, but the majority. And we need to have those places, even within these kinds of institutions, where those who are coming, those who are settlers don't necessarily have the same kind of access to, right? This is why inclusion and multiculturalism doesn't solve all our problems. So just leave you with that final message.
Thank you so much for that compelling talk and all the wonderful answers you gave. Thank you to everyone who came out tonight. And I wanted to mention that there's a fourth and final event of this series. It's a talk by Dr. Bettina Love in just under 2 weeks, and I'll send out the Eventbrite link for that so you can register to everyone who's here tonight. But thank you again so much, Dr. TallBear. That left us with a lot to think about and do.
Have a great evening, everybody. Thank you.
You as well. Thank you.